What do experimental sketchbooks actually look like? Well, in today's video, I'm going to show you some examples of my own sketchbooks, and I'm going to give you a list of criteria that I use when I look at how experimental a sketchbook is. Hello, welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm Tracy Eastham. I'm an artist and owner of Art School by Subscription, which is an online space for artists who want to deepen their creative work with a mix of experimentation, concept and community. So I hope you like all the videos that I've got on those topics. Lots of artists come to me and say they want to be a bit more experimental with their artwork. They want to try new things out. They want to develop new creative pathways, but they don't know where to start. They say things like, I want to loosen up, I want to get more experimental, but how do I do it? So there's lots of different ways that you can be experimental. I've got little lessons and challenges on being more experimental, but one key way is by having a sketchbook. So the reason why a sketchbook is more experimental on the whole than loose sheets of paper or board or canvas is that we're a little less precious about it. If we're working on a canvas board, which has cost us a few pounds, it automatically feels like a finished artwork. So we put more pressure on it. We put more weight of expectation on it as well. If we use a sketchbook, which is ideally a bit cheaper, then we don't have that same sense that it has to be a final work of art, a final piece. To enhance that even further, I would recommend getting fairly cheap paper-backed sketchbook. Not one of those really fancy leather-bound ones that we're going to be all too precious about. Just a good quality but quite cheap and inexpensive sketchbook. They're usually the ones that will allow you to be more experimental, simply because you're not worried about messing it up too much. And as you can see from my pile of sketchbooks here, they're all a bit ragged, and that's fine. But what do they look like? So I've got a range of sketchbooks here from my own creative journey, ranging from sketchbooks that I had when I was at college, right through to sketchbooks I was doing on my master's degree down in London. So the first criteria that I look for in experimental sketchbooks is unfinished work. So the beginnings of artworks that have been abandoned. Now this might feel like it's a wrong thing to do, but actually embracing unfinished elements in our sketchbooks can really help us to work a lot freer. If we're not pressuring ourselves to finish a work, we don't feel we can feel much more likely to take a risk and allow things to go a bit wrong. And if it does, it's okay, because we can just abandon it. So here you can say I've done a quick sketch of what I think was a mountaintop. I think this was a quick watercolor of a building, and I've abandoned them halfway through, and that's fine. That's allowed me to move on to the next thing that felt better. The other thing that I look for in experimental sketchbooks is repetition, but with different materials or different methods. So this is a really old sketchbook of mine from when I was at high school, I believe. So forgive me. But here we've got, it was a project on insects, and we've got a drawing of some insects, but I've also got an insect made out of felt. So that's very experimental. Moving on to my A-level sketchbook, when I was interested in the human body, I've made some photocopies which I've watercolored and then cut up to make a sort of collage. And then I've repeated studies of the same body but in different positions, and I've done it in watercolors, I've done it in oil pastels, I've done it in chalk pastels, and I've gone on to do it in pencil and charcoal. So there's repetition there. I haven't just tried to perfect it once. I'm repeating it over and over again in lots of different methods, scales and materials to try and find what it is that is working for me, the colour scheme or the method of handling the paint or the composition or whatever. There's repetition, but with different materials and methods. We can see that here with a later sketchbook. I was looking at hands, and you can see I've done hands over and over again. I've done it with charcoal, chalk pastel, oil paints, watercolours, acrylics, and watercolours again, but with a different type of paper underneath. One was with watercolour paper, one was with cartridge paper. So there's that repetition there, but experimenting with different materials and different methods. I'd say this is the easiest way of being experimental, because if we have a subject matter, the easiest way to be experimental is to just repeat that subject matter, but in different materials or in different methods, different composition, different scale, different size, something like that. So the next thing that I look for is annotation, or writing, making notes. I think that's a really important part of an experimental sketchbook, and it can take any forms, including just little bits of writing around the sketchbook. I say text should cover three main things. It should tell you very practically what you were doing. So what material, this was with oil pastels, say, or this was drawn on such a date. So sort of practical, factual elements. But then it should also contain how you felt about it. So did it go well, or did it not go so well? And maybe a bit of concept development, like this reminds me of that, or it looks a little bit like this, or, a little bit of discussion around the idea of the piece, the underlying concept. What doing your sketch or painting or whatever made you think about. Sometimes, like here, it can be quite long pieces of text, and sometimes it can just be little short snippets. But text and annotation is always something I like to see in an experimental sketchbook, because we need to be able to reflect on what we're doing in order to move on, in order to get the lessons from each piece. So another important thing that I always see in all experimental sketchbooks is colour swatches. So I believe down here at the end, I've got a good example of a colour swatch. Yep. So little colour swatches where you're experimenting with colours. What do different colours make? What's the feeling of the vibe that you're trying to go for with the artwork? Are you going for a muted colour palette? Are you going for a bold colour palette? There's usually in experimental sketchbooks little colour swatches like this, which show that you're researching the colours, different brands of colour, different make, different mixes, different blends. I usually see colour swatches in experimental sketchbooks. The single most important thing about an experimental sketchbook is that you carry on from failures. There's lots of failures in these sketchbooks, but you include the failures and you carry on from the failures. That is key. So this was my first sketchbook from my master's degree, and it is full of failures because I was struggling. I was really struggling with the course. I was really struggling with my response to the brief, etc. And you can see in a sketchbook, you can see that I'm struggling. The work isn't good. It's haphazard, but I've carried on. And as I've moved on, I've started to develop an idea. There starts to become a narrative, a recognizable stream of thought, and the work starts to become a little bit more refined and cohesive. That was my first sketchbook, and then I think it went on to this one. And as you go along, it just gets stronger and stronger. Still experimenting with mediums and scales and things, but it becomes more confident and cohesive. But you've got to move on from failure. You've got to embrace it, reflect on it, and move on from it. There's always going to be lots of failures in an experimental sketchbook. And then the last thing I'd say is that you need, it's not overly important, but it's good to see a central thread in an experimental sketchbook. We want to see that you're trying new avenues and you're taking risks, but usually in a strong experimental sketchbook, there is a central thread of narrative that flows through it. That might be quite obscure or it might be quite obvious, but it probably will be there. And you might only see it afterwards. You might think that the sketchbook is random, that it's haphazard, but actually when you look back several months later, you think, actually, this is where I was developing my central ideas, my central theme. So that's often in experimental sketchbooks as well. So I do just want to make a slight distinction, which is a difference between concept-driven experimental sketchbooks and creative journaling. Now, I love to creative journal. I'm not saying one is better than the other, but with creative journaling, which is an example here, it's about exploring materials and technique. It's a process-driven activity. It's not essentially driven by a theme or a concept, although sometimes it can be, but the main focus is about materials and texture and mark making. It's a process-based thing. I love my creative journal, which I add to on an ongoing basis, but there is a slight difference, and it's that element of concept, that sort of central conceptual thread which runs through things a bit stronger in the experimental sketchbooks a bit more. So thank you for joining me in this video about experimental sketchbooks. I hope it's given you some ideas about how you can be a bit more experimental. Make sure you check out my other videos, which are on a range of topics, but all connected to concept and experimentation and risk-taking to deepen your creative practice. And also check the links below where you can sign up to my newsletter and get free challenges, including a creative experimentation challenge.